The change of plans. I was initially just going to start in on Daniel, and then I was going over the handout this morning again, and I thought, it'd kind of be nice to lay down a little bit of history before we get too deep into the book itself, and hopefully just kind of understand some things about the general time frame and some of the events that were going on during this time in the book of Daniel itself. If I get this, I don't know if this will show up there or not. Oh, did you see my mouse up there? Okay. It's a fancy pointer tonight. That's what it is. But we're going to be looking at actually 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25. And then we're going to couple that with 2 Chronicles 35 and 36. So I'm going to put some of these passages, probably get most of them, if not all of them, up here tonight that we're going to look at. But if you want to follow along in your Bibles, you're more than welcome to do that. I do a little bit better if I read it out of my Bible while we're going along and talk about some of these things. But what you have in your handouts is basically a timeline of Daniel's life. I'm not going to say this timeline is inspired because some of the things about Daniel's life, we don't really know the exact time or the time frame and some of the events that happened to it. The second handout that you have is what's entitled The Content and the Chronology. And if we have time, I'll see what we can do with that, but imagine we'll be pressed to kind of cover just the timeline itself tonight. If you look at the beginning, though, and this is again just kind of an idea of the general time span and events in the life of Daniel, but it starts in 622 BC. And what we know at this time, what has happened to the northern kingdom of Israel? Yeah, about 720 years before Christ came, the northern kingdom of Israel, was carried away into Assyrian captivity. And so their wickedness peaked a little faster than the wickedness of the southern kingdom. So we're studying the southern kingdom here and some of the things that happened within it, because that's where Daniel came from. He was part of the southern kingdom itself. If you look at the timeline itself, though, and think about how long Daniel lived, anybody have a general idea how long Daniel lived?
Somewhere around 80 years.
Yeah, it's pretty well consensus that, given the events and reading about the characters and the things that happened in his life, he probably lived to be somewhere in his 80s. And most of the life that he lived, of course, was spent in captivity, though. And some of the events that happened to Daniel in the book of Daniel, sometimes I think we think about him as being this young teenage boy, but actually some of the events that you read about, pretty familiar ones, happened to him way up and in late into his life, probably when he's even in his 80s, some of these things that we read about within the book itself. But what I want you to pay attention to and where I want us to start here tonight is going to be over in, go up to the top of your page here, it'll be the top of your right-hand page, but the kings of Judah. And the first one that's listed in these kings of Judah is Josiah. And that's where I want to start here tonight and kind of give you a general background, biblical background of the things that were happening and how Daniel winds up where he is and how Nebuchadnezzar is where he is in the beginning of the book of Daniel itself. But the timeline starts with the idea of Josiah being the ruler of the king of Judah, the southern kingdom, when Daniel is born. Now, Daniel is evidently some kind of nobility. Some people believe he was related to Josiah, some relative of Josiah. Could have been. We do know this, he was evidently part of the who's who in the southern kingdom. Because when Nebuchadnezzar comes and carries the captives away, who does he take? Did he take the poor peasants?
Ones that could help him out more and the ones that were not poor.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that he did. Any person of influence he removed from the kingdom. And I think part of that was kind of a safety feature because he didn't want an uprising. He didn't want anybody with power and, with a following to get this huge uprising and turn against him. So all those people, the kings, the noble people, the royals, the officials, even the commanders of the army, anybody who had any money, there was over 10,000 people that Nebuchadnezzar carries captive in the first time that he comes against Jerusalem. And so Daniel is actually the part of what we call the first carrying away of the southern kingdom. Now, I don't remember I don't know if you can remember back when we studied the kings of Judah, the kings of Israel, of course studied 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, talked a lot about them, but this is where some of that knowledge and some of those things that we talk about there kind of come into play and helps you out and helps you understand just a little bit. But basically, there were 3 carrying aways of the southern kingdom. There was only one of the northern kingdom, 721 BC, somewhere in that area. They were carried off into Assyrian captivity. That was basically, that they never really regained full status again. But there were actually 3 different carryings away of the southern kingdom, and they were all done by Nebuchadnezzar. And so what we begin with here is in the rule of Josiah. Now, you can stop for a moment again. This was a long time ago. We studied Josiah, but do you remember anything about Josiah whenever we studied him? Or do you know anything about him?
Good king.
Yeah, very good king, great king. We might even say godly, very godly man. And if you go back to 2 Kings chapter 23, again, I'm going to kind of try to put some of these things up here to help you out. But in verse 25, here's what it says about Josiah. Now before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Nor after him did any arise like him. One of the greatest, if not the greatest king that the southern kingdom ever had. But as great and as godly of a man that he was, he still could not keep God's judgment coming upon the southern kingdom. And that's what you continue reading about in this passage. In verse 26 there of 2 Kings 23, it says, Nevertheless, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, with which his anger was aroused against Judah, because of all the provocation with which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will also remove Judah from my sight, as I have removed Israel, and will cast off this city Jerusalem, which I have chosen, and the house which I said my name shall be there. So you read a little bit about Josiah. As good and as godly as a man that he was, he reigned for 31 years, died at a very young age at this point in time, almost 39 years old, almost 40 years old. But as good as the king that he was, and as much reformation as he did for Judah, for the southern kingdom, it wasn't going to stop the judgment of God from coming upon him. And God said, all these sins and all these iniquities that they've been committing, they've been piling up, I'm going to do to them what I did to Israel, to the northern king. I'm going to carry them away into captivity. I'm going to bring them into judgment. And so you read about Josiah there, verse 28, the rest of his acts, all that he did, they're written in the Chronicles of the kings of Judah. Notice verse 29. In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went to the aid to this king of Assyria, to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went against him. And Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo when he confronted him. So Josiah dies at almost 40 years of age. He dies in a battle with the Pharaoh of Egypt, this time Pharaoh Necho, as he's identified in this particular passage. Now, there's a few things to kind of point out about this. Remember, this is the message. The judgment of God's coming upon Judah. Okay, the judgment of God is coming upon the southern kingdom for all their sins, all their iniquities, all the innocent blood that they shed. God said, I'm going to do to them what I've done to the northern kingdom by carrying them away into captivity. And so Josiah dies. He dies by the hand of Pharaoh Necho. If you parallel the Kings and the Chronicles, of course, we studied this, read through a lot of it, but you probably already know it yourself. You'll get a lot of details from one account that you won't get from another. And when you read about the death of Josiah, a couple of things that are of interest. 2 Chronicles chapter 35 tells you a little bit more about how this happened and the events leading up to it. But in verse 20 there of 2 Chronicles 35, it says, after all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But he sent messengers to him, saying, what have I to do with you, king of Judah? I have not come against you this day, but against the house with which I have war. For God commanded me to make haste, refrain from meddling with God, who is with me, lest he destroy you. Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself so that he might fight with him, and he did not heed the words of Necho from the mouth of God. So he came to fight in the valley of Megiddo, and the archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, take me away, for I am severely wounded. His servants therefore took him out of that chariot and put him in the second chariot that he had, and they brought him to Jerusalem. So he died and was buried in one of the tombs of his father, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. A couple of things that are of importance leading up to the context of the book of Daniel. First of all, who is, as you read along this, who is the major world power at this time? There's really probably two that you can identify. Egypt is one of them, right? Egypt was a very powerful nation for a long time. Anybody know what the other one would be? Well, it'd be Assyria. They were the ones who had carried away the northern kingdom. But they were the two major world powers for a long time. But in the shadows, you have this other major empire or kingdom that's starting to grow. And that is the Babylonian Empire. That's Nebuchadnezzar that we read about in the book of Daniel. But here's what's of interest as you go through this and you read it. If you remember back in 2 Kings, it says that Pharaoh Necho, where was he going? Yeah. He was going down there, and of course, where's the verse that I'm looking for here? 29. Okay, Megiddo. Yeah, and if you go back up to verse 21, though, as he's going, Josiah sees him and sees this army, and Josiah mounts his military force, and he goes out and he says, we're going to fight. And Pharaoh Necho says, well, I didn't come to fight with you. You know, I'm not coming over here. I'm not trying to pick a fight. I'm not trying to go to war with you. But he said, I am going up to, and we read, I think, in 2 Chronicles, he was going up to aid Assyria. Well, why would Assyria need aid? Babylon. Okay, this new world empire is rising. And so they're a threat to Egypt, they're a threat to the Assyrians. Egypt and the Assyrians went in with alliance together, and they said, we'll fight against these guys and we'll try to beat them, before they take over all of our territories. So that's where Pharaoh Necho was headed. As he was going there, Josiah comes out and he says, I want to fight. And Pharaoh says, God's sent me on a mission. My fight's not with you today. God has sent me on a mission. If you start messing with me, you're going to be messing with God, he said. And Josiah wouldn't listen, and Josiah attacks him, and Josiah winds up dying in this battle. But it gives you an idea about some of the world powers and some of the things that are going on, how all these dominoes, fall into place, where the book of Daniel is going to start as it does as we get over there. So Josiah is dead, and as we go on and progress and read through the Kings, I'm trying to find I can't even see back there. It's so bad. But if you look in your timeline here, you can see, of course, right here where Josiah ends. And then what you have after that is you have Jehoahaz. And here's how it's recorded in the Bible, how all these things come to pass. In 2 Chronicles chapter 36, beginning verse 1, after Josiah dies, it says, Then the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and made him king in his father's place in Jerusalem. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. You look at his reign, it's very short reign. And notice why. Notice what happens, verse 3 here, 2 Chronicles 36. Now the king of Egypt deposed him at Jerusalem, and he imposed on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Then the king of Egypt made Jehoahaz his brother Eliakim king over Judah and Jerusalem, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. And Necho took Jehoahaz his brother and carried him off to Egypt. So remember what happened. Pharaoh Necho, he's going out here, aid the Assyrians. Josiah attacks him. He kills Josiah. They've lost the leader, but his fight's not with Israel. So he immediately, after this battle, he immediately heads straight for Assyria. And now, what happened in the meantime? Well, the people of Israel have taken Josiah's son, and they appointed him king. 3 months later, Pharaoh Necho is done with his battle, and he comes back through. And now he says, I'm going to deal with Israel. So he takes the person that they want to be their king, removes him from office, carries him captive down into Egypt, and then he appoints his brother as king over Egypt. The Bible says his name was Eliakim, but Pharaoh Necho changed his name to Jehoiakim. And so if you look at your timeline there, the kings of Judah, that's what you'll see in those timelines. You'll see the end of Josiah. You'll see Jehoahaz, 3 months that he reigned. Pharaoh Necho comes back through Israel. He says, this is what you guys want. I'm going to take it away from you. He removes that king. He appoints his brother as king. That was Eliakim, changed his name to Jehoiakim. And so you have this, again, you're having these changes in leaders and powers, and all of it's connected to the book of Daniel. And really, if somebody were to ask me, what do you think the book of Daniel is about? I would tell you it's about world empires. Because if you stop and you really read the book, you got a lot of good stories in the book, but through them all, God is revealing himself to them, and he knows what's going to happen, and he has in his mind some greater kingdom that's going to come someday. That's really the book of the message of the book of Daniel. And I won't get into it tonight, but if you want to figure out the book of Revelation, you can just link it pretty closely there with Daniel, and you'll have it. But you have the Jehoiakim entering into office there. Now, here's what's happened. Remember, God said, I'm bringing judgment against the southern kingdom. Okay, I'm going to do to them just like I did to the northern kingdom, to Israel. But did God just only judge his own nation as you read through the Old Testament? No, he judged all nations, didn't he? And so a lot of times when you read about these prophets in the Old Testament, they not only have a message for the people of God, they have a message for other nations too. And one of those prophets that you'll read about who was like that was Jeremiah. Jeremiah had a message for God's people, but he also had messages for other nations too that were given to him by God. And when you turn over to the book of Jeremiah chapter 46, beginning verse 1, and here's what it says. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet against the nations, against Egypt, concerning the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was by the river Euphrates in Carchemish, and which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, defeated in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. So you have a couple verses here that kind of tie all these events together. And basically what we learn about is not only was God going to judge the southern kingdom of Israel, God was also going to judge the nation of Egypt too. He was going to bring judgment against Pharaoh Necho and his armies. Who was that judgment, or what form did God's judgment take place? How was he going to carry out justice?
Through them.
Yeah, through Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. When did this happen? When did the nation of Egypt get judged? There you go. The 4th year of Jehoiakim, just like Jeremiah said, right? There's a couple things to understand. The way Jeremiah, the way Jews and the way Babylonians counted time was a little bit different too. Babylonians always counted, a year wasn't a year until it was a full year. I think we got people like that in the United States too. Some people will say, well, been there a year, but you've only been there 6 months. Well, we're just kind of saying a round figure. There's other people who won't say they've been there a year until they've been there a full year, right? And you'll read about the 4th year of Jehoiakim in Jeremiah's account. In Daniel's account, you'll read about the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. So they're talking about the same thing, but just to understand, it's kind of like the New Testament when you read Mark and then you read Matthew or one of those other accounts of the gospel. The way that they tell time, one was Jewish time, the other one was Roman time. And so you read about, in this one, one is the way the Jews count years, one is the way that the Babylonians counted years. But they're referring to the same event. So in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, this is the guy who Pharaoh Necho appointed as king over Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar comes and defeats Pharaoh Necho and the armies of Egypt. So now you've got kind of a time period where basically Babylon is going to lay claim to everything that Egypt was over. They do the same thing with the Assyrians when they defeat the Assyrians. They're going to lay a claim to all their kingdoms, all the people and all the nations, and they're going to do to them what they want done. And so you kind of read about that as you go on through the Bible. If you go back to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, you'll get tired of seeing this one. 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 5. Here's what it says. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against him and bound him in bronze fetters to carry him off to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried off some of the articles, notice that, some of the articles, from the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon. So here's what we can see as we look at this timeline. Again, if you look back up to the right hand of your timeline, you got Josiah, you got Jehoahaz, the guy who was there 3 months. Pharaoh Necho comes back from his battle with his Syrians. He stops, he takes him out of power because that's who the people wanted. And he basically appoints Eliakim, his brother, changes his name to Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim reigns for 11 years. In the 4th year of his reign, though, Egypt is defeated. So now you have Babylon laying claim to the southern kingdom of Israel. Egypt was in charge of it before. Since Babylon has defeated Egypt, now they inherit everything that they had, their empire, and the people and the nations that were in it. So now what happens? Well, immediately what happens is Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to do what I want to do with this nation. And so he goes there. Who's appointed? Well, it's Jehoiakim. He's only reigned for 4 years. And basically he strikes up a deal with him. And he says, if you pay me tribute, I'll let you stay in office. You do what I tell you to do. You keep everybody in line. When I want something done, you do it. I'll let you be king over this area, the southern kingdom of Israel. And so Jehoiakim agrees to that. Now, there's a change, though, that takes place in Jehoiakim's attitude as we read. In 2 Kings chapter 24 and verse 1, it says, in his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. So for 3 years, Jehoiakim stayed in line. He did everything that Nebuchadnezzar told him to do. He ran everything like he wanted it. run. But then what happened? Well, the last part of verse 1 tells us he decided he was going to go against Nebuchadnezzar. So he turns and he rebels against him. Well, what do you think Nebuchadnezzar did about that? He's a pretty understanding guy when you read about his historical actions, wasn't he? The dude was a nut. And so he flew off the handle. Remember, he came the first time, and when he came, he did whatever he wanted to do with what was there. Well, he let Jehoiakim stay in office, but he says, I don't want all these powerful people staying here. So I'm going to take them back with me, 10,000 of them. I will relocate them. He says, hey, that temple over there's got some pretty good, got some golden articles and silver. I'm going to take some of those things back with me to Babylon too. And so that's what you have the first time that Nebuchadnezzar comes and encounters Jehoiakim in office. Now, the second time that he comes, Jehoiakim has rebelled against him. And so obviously Nebuchadnezzar isn't going to put up with that. He goes in, he says it's time for new leadership. Takes him out of office, takes him back to Babylon, puts him in prison. Really don't learn how he dies, but he ends up dying. His son reigns for like 3 months. And at the beginning of the year, Nebuchadnezzar says, we're going to clean house. We're going to start all over. So he goes back, takes some more people, takes some more stuff out of the temple, and then he puts Zedekiah in charge. And Zedekiah, basically, he hangs in there for 11 years. He ends up rebelling again. And the third time that Nebuchadnezzar has to come back to Jerusalem, he says, we're going to fix this permanently. And that's when he takes everything out of the temple. That's when he burns all the buildings. That's when he breaks down the wall. That's basically where he takes Jerusalem and levels it to the ground. It takes anybody of any value and any worth out of that place and puts them somewhere else. But the reason that all these things are so important is when you read about Daniel, Daniel is a victim of time and circumstance. And when you turn over to Daniel chapter 1, here's the information that we're given as we read about Daniel and some of the things that are going on. Notice what it says. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried in the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Remember I told you that Nebuchadnezzar carries 10,000 people captive the first time he comes? Guess who one of those people is? It's Daniel. Now you think about Daniel. Was Daniel a godly man? Yeah. We might need to start over if anybody doubts that. He was a very godly man. So why did he wind up in captivity?
God had a purpose. God had a purpose.
The judgment of God on the southern kingdom. It was no fault of his own. I mean, you look at Josiah. Josiah was a great king, a godly king, but even he couldn't stop the judgment of God from coming upon this southern kingdom. God said, I'm going to do to you guys what I did to your neighbors, the northern kingdom. I'm going to let you be carried away into captivity. Victim of time and circumstance. That was Daniel, and that's his life. I mean, basically, as probably a teenager, he's carried away into captivity, and probably for the next 70 years of his life, he lives it in a foreign empire. Never gets to go back home, never gets to see his homeland. Yes. Yes, all these people who were carried off were made eunuchs.
I don't remember reading it. Actually, I just inferred that from what he did to the people who served in his palace, but I never actually remember reading it.
Yeah, any of those people, especially foreigners who were in the palace around royalty, they were fixed in such a manner that they could not have children and offspring. So, I don't need to go into great detail on that, but I think you understand why. But when Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem for the first time, wisely Jehoiakim, he winds up surrendering, and Judah becomes a vassal state to Babylon. And because Jehoiakim surrenders, Nebuchadnezzar lets him stay in power. But again, he went into the temple, he took what he wanted, took some valuables, took them back with him to Babylon. He went through all the people, and he took all the people he wanted but with him too. It was his empire, it was his nation and his people. He's going to do with it what he wanted done. And after that, you read about the second invasion, the second deportation. That's the book of Ezekiel. Well, Ezekiel was one of those who was deported in the second capture of the besieging of the city of Jerusalem. And then you have the third besieging, and incidentally, think about the timeline. I think we talked about this when we studied it. 605 BC is what we call the first carrying away. 597 is the second. 586 is the third. And so in that short period of time, you have three different carryings away, and eventually the temple is cleaned out. The entire city of Jerusalem is left destroyed. But if you look back there in Daniel 1 and verse 2, note exactly what verse 2 says. The Lord delivered King Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Why? That was the judgment of God coming upon the southern kingdom. That was because of all the things that they had done. And so Nebuchadnezzar was acting as God's agent against Jerusalem. And remember, God, for more than 200 years, God had sent prophet after prophet. He warned the people. He told them to repent and change. They ignored that message. And so eventually the compassion of the Lord runs out. And wrongs had to be dealt with. Justice had to be served. Judgment had to fall upon this nation. Daniel was just an unfortunate victim of those circumstances. But it is kind of interesting to think about how Daniel winds up where he is. A couple of things that are worth pointing out. I'm doing this more for Will's sake than mine, but the content and the chronology. If you look at that handout, I think I've got it up here. Yeah. Here's something to remember as we go through the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is not in chronological order. Okay, so that means you can't just start at the beginning and read through it, and this is the way it all happened in this order. What you have to understand is, and this pretty good table or chart, I don't know exactly how you divide it up, Will. Okay, good. That's the right way. But you read the first 4 chapters, and they deal with Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, that's the beginning. So those first 4 chapters are in order. There's a few rulers that come in between, don't last a long time. Some of them are kind of like semi-rulers and things like that. But the next great ruler that you read about is Belshazzar. Well, you'll read about Belshazzar in chapter 5, right? And what happens to him in chapter 5? Yeah, he's dead. But then when you go to chapter 7, Daniel says, I had this dream in the days of Belshazzar. And you say, wait a minute, I thought he was dead. Well, the book's not in chronological order. Okay, it's not set up, designed to say, read through this is the way it went, this is the order that all these things happen. So basically what you have is you have Nebuchadnezzar, the first 4 chapters, then you can shift over to chapter 7 and 8, and that'll be kind of the next one in order. Then you go back to chapter 5 and 6, and then from there on you can pretty well chapter 6 I guess is the lion's den. That's in Cyrus's day, so you have to put that down on the end there. But 7 and 8, then chapter 5, then 6 and 9, and then the rest of the book. And so the thing that I want to encourage you to think about as we read through this, sometimes you go from one chapter to the next, you're actually rewinding instead of going forward. And if you can kind of keep that in mind as you go through the book, I think it helps a lot in getting all these events straight and then talking about how how they all work together to accomplish the main message of the book of Daniel. Okay, so that's kind of a quick introduction. This is one of those things, you either love it or you hate it. I love history. I love reading about these things, but it is interesting to me when you think about Daniel, you just read about why did Nebuchadnezzar do something like that? Why did Daniel, a good and a godly teenager, get carried off into captivity? Well, the answers are all there in the Bible. But as you begin that book, that's where we're starting with Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian Empire has just become the New World Empire. And so we'll talk about some of the things that happened then. I think, like I said, Will's going to pick up in chapter 7. Is that right? And he's going to teach from there on. So, all right. Out of time tonight. Anybody got any thoughts, comments, questions before we end?